All right, so I pushed record. So welcome everyone to our Zoom conversation about grief, particularly in this time of COVID-19 worries. This is a conversation where we will talk about some of the ways that death and dying during this time might be a little bit unique than other times and other faith rituals that we might have. We're going to talk about some of the ways that pastoral leaders and those who are helping others with grief rituals can make some modifications during times like these. And hopefully, if people are interested to share some ideas that they might have, we can do a little bit of idea sharing as well. I'll be posting links to some of the stuff that gets talked about on virtualgrace.org afterwards if you want to go back and look at any of the resources. So let's begin with thinking about some of the things that might be different or pressing and on people's minds kind of during this time frame. One of the really big ones is that one of the common fears around death and dying is the fear that people will die alone, that they won't be able to have community with them, or they won't be able to resolve final issues that they have. That's something that is really difficult. If you are like me, I'm currently in San Francisco, and we are on whole city lockdown where people need to stay in their houses. A week ago, it was declared by order of the mayor that you cannot visit people in the hospital, you cannot visit people in nursing homes, and you cannot visit people in medical facilities right now. So that changes the way that we might have perceived culturally that death and dying happens. If you imagine settings in a hospital situation where people come around and they can say goodbyes or have anything like that happen, because saying goodbye could be deadly in a time like this, we have to think about ways that we can do that in alternative ways, do that in advance, do that on the phone, or find ways to grieve if we didn't get the opportunity to do that, right? So that can be writing letters to people after they've deceased to try to get some of that out. But just know that people who are in vulnerable populations, people who are already experiencing health issues, they might not come out and say, I'm afraid of dying alone, or I'm afraid of dying in a way that harms other people who come to visit me or who come to care for me. But know that that might be something that's in their heart that they're thinking about. Are there other fears that you think would be good to name kind of from the beginning as we're thinking about people who are dying or people who are grieving? Amanda?
Hi folks, I'm Amanda and I serve in at Central Lutheran Church in Portland, Oregon. We are not yet on lockdown, but we have had a restriction to no groups very large. So one of the pieces that I've heard folks expressing anxiety and fear around in this particular topic is the idea that they won't get to have a funeral. And I know that in Washington, the guidelines, which is just north of us, the guidelines for what gatherings are allowed and what gatherings are not allowed. And right now public gatherings are limited to 50 or under. And I think that number keeps dropping each day, kind of a thing. One of the things that was explicitly stated in the governor's not allowed thing is weddings and funerals. So that's a big deal, to be able to say that we don't know if we'll be able to have public funerals right now. And I know that there are other concerns about finding organizations that will accept and assist with caring for the body of a loved one who has passed away, who has died from COVID-19. So it's a big anxiety that's starting, especially for my folks who are currently caring for aging and ailing parents. And not just the idea that they're not going to get to say goodbye to them in person anymore, but that they may not even get to gather for a funeral, either because they're at a far distance and can't travel, or because funerals aren't being allowed within the state. So I want to name that and bring that into the room.
Yeah. Frederica?
I'm good.
Okay. Yeah, so that's some of the fears that are in kind of these conversations. Another thing to know about if you're not aware of how the process of death and body recovery happens is that it's really important to, particularly as people are having fears about what their funerals will be like, if they come to faith leaders or for other people with guidance about how they could do a funeral in a time like this. One of the things you'll want to check in is, what are the local laws near you? Do you live in a community where you can bury someone in the backyard or not? There are parts of the United States where you can do that. There's parts of the United States where even funeral homes can't do that. Here in San Francisco, we have only one person who's buried in the entire city. It's Starr King, the creator of the Unitarian Universalist faith. Look it up, it's just a fun fact. The other thing that would be really helpful to know is whether or not in your city and county you have a medical examiner or a coroner. A medical examiner is someone who is medically trained, who will do a full autopsy and who will give you a death notification in a pretty timely way. Here in San Francisco, it's between 1 month and 2 months. That's really important because if you need to have benefits from your insurance company in order to have a funeral, having a death certificate can be part of that process sometimes. Coroners are elected, and in some parts of the United States don't have to have any sort of funeral training, any sort of autopsy training, might not have a budget for any supplies. There are a number of coroners' offices who don't have refrigeration. That changes how we think about funerals and dying in times like these. In San Francisco, sorry if this is really blunt, but talking about death kind of has to be that way when we're talking about funeral arrangements. And know that I'm telling you kind of the basic facts of things so that you can find the right way to translate that to someone who's in the midst of grief. Not because I do this a lot and I'm a chaplain for the police department. That's probably part of it too. But so in San Francisco, we have the capacity for up to 4,000 individuals to be stored at one given time, kind of through our emergency preparedness funds. So what that means is, here in San Francisco, if the medical examiner's office allowed it, which they would have to make a case-by-case decision, they could provide storage that could allow for a funeral to happen later, up to a year after, so that a funeral could happen in a delayed way. Most parts of the country do not have that ability for storage to delay a funeral. So you might not want to call your medical examiner's office right now today, but you might put it on the list of questions that you have as something that you can ask someone. And so that can be one option. If someone's really insistent that they need to have a funeral or they've prepaid it, like many members of my family have prepaid it, there's the option of storing someone for a funeral at a later date where they might be corporally present, or having that person be cared for in a time efficient way, particularly if that's a part of their faith practice, to have that happen within 3 days, and then to delay the funeral without someone being corporally present and having that ritual at a later time. What that can mean for people in a time of crisis and trauma is that when an emergency happens, the part of our brain that is responsible for long-term memory shuts off. It like goes into power mode so that we can focus on just the things we need to do to survive in this very moment. So our vision tunnels to about right here, right? So that means that during funeral planning, someone might run into any sharp corner that's near you while you're doing funeral planning, right? So round tables, things that are really easy to see, large font, people's vision shrinks. It's hard for them to see what's happening. We would want to remember that because in your brain, you've just gotten cortisol and adrenaline from this emergency, it's the exact same chemical composition as when you give birth, right? So those chemicals that are in your body make it very difficult to retain information. So when you're having a conversation with someone in the midst of trauma about their grief, you want to always have it in writing, whatever you've said. Because you could say it 15 times and that person's brain is just turned off in the places that are going to remember what's happening. The good news is they will remember how you made them feel, even if they can't remember any of the questions you just answered. So what you can do is start with a frequently asked questions section if you want to email it to someone as a follow-up to your congregation or to give them a handout. Amanda looks like she wants to add something. Right
I do. I just want to say that if there are people who are hearing that and are like, oh, that's why I was like that, like hear that as permission as well, and like normalizing the fact that it's really common. Grief brain or widow brain, sometimes people have talked about having like chemo brain, like that kind of brain tunnel vision stuff. That's all really legitimate and really real. And it doesn't mean that you are beginning any signs like in general. I shouldn't say it doesn't mean, but in general, it's not early onset dementia. It's not something that's wrong with you, that you suddenly can't remember anything.
That's right.
What Pastor Megan is describing here is a genuine, normal chemical piece that happens to human bodies in times of grief and trauma. And so giving yourself some grace, writing down lots of notes, even if I'm not a note taker. I can't stand notes. They make me feel like I'm being, I don't know, caged in by to do things. But in times of grief and trauma, it's really okay to try and keep some notes or have a loved one who is doing that for or alongside of you. If you're a pastor who is guiding your people through this situation, then this is a time for you to go ahead and be writing down those notes.
That's right.
For the person that you are serving alongside of, just because this is super, super real and super common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can get those effects of trauma brain. In schools, they call it stress brain. You could call it critical stress when there's something that's happening to an entire community. You can get that just from watching CNN, right? You can get that same chemical rush just from reading the paper a lot and worrying about whether or not you have the symptoms, or worrying about your children or people that you love. So know that you don't have to have an actual death of someone you know to experience grief.
Or your Facebook feed.
That's right.
Or the Twitter feed.
That's right.
Yeah, super real, folks.
Yeah, it's super real. And there are actual, I'll put links up for what critical stress does to your brain, so that if you're in critical stress mode right now, just from the way the news is, that you can re-look it up later. Know that most people experience that time period. What we don't know is how long this kind of emergency will last, right? We don't know how long it's going to be in the news that a lot of people are sick. And so however long this time period of quarantine and fear and nervousness lasts, know that about 3 days after that is when these chemicals will dump. And when the chemicals dump, they go real low. You're going to be angry and shout at people. You're going to be crabby. You're going to be irritable. It's going to feel like you drank coffee 5 times a day, every day, and then you just stop drinking coffee. That's what it will feel like in your nervous system. It will feel painful from the inside, and you won't be able to fix it. You can calm it down a little bit through self-care, and the ways to do that is anything that's not harming you or someone else that makes it feel better is a good choice, and then choose something safer when you're not dumping those chemicals. Does that make sense? Right? It's better to be overweight than to take your own life. It's better to be most any choice than to struggle like that. So I just want to name that in advance, that we don't know when this is going to end, but that's when our chemicals are going to dump. And simultaneously, as a country, as a world, we're all going to be yelling at each other, and we won't know why, because we survived, and why the heck are we mad? But we just are. When people give birth to a baby, see, I'm reminded of it. When people give birth to a baby, their peers know that they're going to have this chemical dump and that there might be feelings afterwards for a very long period of time. And so people in your community sometimes will ask you, how you doing with that? In an emergency like this, most people aren't going to be aware that we have that same postpartum, because it's weird to have postpartum from a terrible thing. And so we're still going to want to check in with each other. That means that after a death or after a trauma like this, pastors set your whatever way you calendar 3 days after the big thing, check in with the people about why they're grumpy. 3 months out is typically when people go into the hardest parts of grief, because that's when no one's looking and they can have their true feelings while no one's looking, like they're not having a performance of grief, they're not being observed. And that's when most people's support networks stop reaching out to them. So pastors should check in 3 months afterwards. And then you should also put in your calendar the date of the thing that triggered them, so that you can check in with them each year on the date that that thing triggered them, because it will likely trigger them again each additional year. So that's some of the chemical stuff you can pay attention to. Oh, the thing I almost forgot is, when I said almost everything is helpful as long as it's not harmful, the one thing that you'll want to know is that 3-day window of chemical dumping that you'll get after a big incident like this will take 3 times longer for you to endure if you have caffeine, or alcohol. That doesn't mean you can't make choices to still have caffeine or alcohol during those times. Just know that it will make that time that you are experiencing this chemical dump 3 times longer. So you can choose that, you can embrace that. Maybe caffeine is more important to you than being done with the chemical dump. I have no judgment about that. But I just want people to know, so that if they are trying to expedite that crappy feeling that comes after a disaster, there's 2 tangible things that you can do to kind of speed it up a little bit. So that's a little bit about the chemistry of what happens in our body. That chemistry happens even if the death isn't experienced by us. And it's particularly experienced by people who have to hear the stories of things that have happened. So that means that faith leaders, anyone who's helping with a funeral service, when you're hearing about these tough things, you get what's called vicarious trauma. And that chemical dump might go on a different cycle than like the event itself. So you want to just make notes for yourself when someone should call you, based on when the dates of those things and chemicals happen. Or start journaling what ways you're not being like your normal self in the midst and the aftermath of those things, so that the next time something hard happens, if you start doing any of those behaviors, you'll know to check in on yourself. And then also write down like what helped, because that will be more important for the future too.
I wanted to lift up that this is an important topic, not just for pastors and caregivers and family members and those kinds of folks, but it's also important for our folks who are journalists and photographers and anyone who is gathering story, so witnessing story. I think that it's easy to forget that our story gatherers are witnessing a lot right now, and it's easy to not offer them as much grace as we do perhaps a loved one of a deceased or that kind of a thing. And there's a lot of stories. It's not just around death of people right now, but death of businesses and death of dreams and those kinds of pieces. And as a culture, the United States is not the most, or North America, I should say, is not the most skilled at grief. We have avoided it substantially. We've avoided it for a long time. We don't like talking about grief, and we don't like talking about death. And this is putting it right in front of us. And we can find ways to learn about how to walk through this, or how to find our way through this well. There are plenty of cultures and plenty of traditions that haven't had the kind of fear around death that the dominant North American culture has had. And so I want to lift that up and say, this is hard because our culture has avoided the topic as much as possible. And now is a chance where we're kind of catching up. It's like being out of condition and the first times you go to the gym, it just kind of sucks. And it hurts, and like your body hurts in odd places that you totally forgot were there, but like people have been getting back into condition for thousands of years, so we can totally do it. It's just not going to be comfortable at all for a little bit, and that's okay.
That's right. And you might have seen Michaela pop in the video there for a second, which is a good reminder that in times like these, we might normally have had conversations like these with children in a different room or being watched by a babysitter when we do funeral arrangements. And we might or might not get those opportunities right now. So be mindful that people of really different age groups will be hearing conversations about death in a way that they probably haven't in a really long time. That can be a really beautiful opportunity because talking about how that process works can be really beautiful with kids. When one of our cats died and the kids asked what it means that people die, and we talked about what different faiths believe, and then just ended that conversation with, so what do you believe? And my kids, of course, being pastors' kids, liked the version of what happens in The Lion King, where people are up in the stars and you get to talk to them forever. And so let your kids have conversations as they do. In this season of Lent, we were supposed to talk to our kids about death anyway. We're just going to do it in a kind of harder way now. But if you want to practice talking about death with your kids, talk about the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus, who is not someone who is their teacher or babysitter or relative, because practicing by having that conversation will make it a lot easier if you have to have a much more difficult conversation, particularly because you're personally grieving at the same time you're trying to talk to kids about this. And so my hunch is that if people are homebound, if every person in our country ends up being homebound, and that means those who have kids are going to be bound together, that the ways that we grieve might be exactly the same, but for some of us, we might be wondering how to do that if we never have a break from our kiddos. And so know that you can weep in a shower without anyone being able to tell which are your tears and which are the shower's water. Know that you can have moments of privacy after people go to bed. Know that you can find those moments away from your kids if you do need some private time for that. But that it will be hard, and we should definitely check in with each other. You probably can't, during times like these, bring casserole to someone's house as a sign that you care for them and you're thinking about them. You probably can't, or might not be. In San Francisco, floral deliveries are closed, right? We don't know if the mail will be delivered during this time that we are at home. I don't know if that's considered an essential service or not. And even if the mail is delivered, with the things we don't know yet about COVID-19, people might be afraid to open the mail even if it did come. And so many of the ways that we have rituals around death and grief are going to have to be modified. And not everyone understands how to open an e-card or how to have a Zoom meeting. So I imagine there will be some mourning gatherings. Even prior to this crisis, I've done funerals where some of the people were in the room and many more of the people were on a Zoom meeting like this. It's It can be difficult for pastors to lead if they're not used to it, particularly if they're having anxiety about the tech parts. So if you are not good at conversations about grief, but you're really good at tech, volunteer to be the person who manages the Zoom meeting for the person who's doing the funeral presentation. I think people are going to want to have rituals like All Saints Day be used in a different way this year, where they can truly grieve and figure things out. But know that in the stages of grief, we know that there's an anger stage. That anger stage of grief means people are going to be mad that they prepaid for a funeral that's not possible, that people are going to be mad that a pastor has to say no to bigger gatherings. That anger grief is a gift to the person who is grieving. They're going to be angry at some point in their grief process. If they are angry with their family that they're in home quarantine with, their home quarantine's gonna go tough, right? If they are angry at law enforcement, there could be consequences for how they're angry with law enforcement. If they are angry with medical folk, there could be consequences for who you say no to, how you say it, and what is happening during these times. And so faith leaders, if you have it in you, if you have a way to be resourced and you have a way to have self-care, if you can give people permission to be angry with you, at you, around you, and not take it personally if you can, that doesn't mean you allow people to harass, intimidate, or abuse you. But if you can find ways to do that, that can be a huge gift to people in times like this when venting might be really hard. I'm gonna just pull up the conversation. Yeah, Frederica has a list of some good children's books on death. And if you wanna either link some of them here or email them to me, I'll put them up with the video. That would be super awesome. Especially both religious and non-religious ones, yes. But if there are particularly ones that people can access without having to go to a library in times like these, hopefully like ebooks. This is a great time to learn about ebooks if you weren't into them before, or audibles. Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic resource for people. The other thing that I wanted to kind of offer as an option for people, you might not have it before you end up on home lockdown if you end up on home lockdown, but you can create a home altar. We made a video from one different religious space called Sagrada in Berkeley about some of the things that you can put in your home altar. But if your place of worship, if the place where you normally have rituals is closed, you can have a dedicated portion of your house where you put things that remind you of the sacred, right? It could be a picture of Guadalupe, it could be a prayer that's your favorite, it could be a picture of the parts of nature that refresh your spirit. I think in times when we can't be in community together, that doesn't mean we can't post a bunch of pictures up on our wall if we have printers that are near us, or set up ways that we are being enriched and having faithful things that are near us. If you're a foodie, I encourage you to make each meal beautiful, right? The more you can find ways to celebrate and savor the life that you have through all 7 of your senses, the easier it will be to be resilient through times like these. So that means you might not be able to leave your house and mourn with other people, but you could think of a smell that helps you remember that person. And maybe in your kitchen cabinet, you have vanilla extract that reminds you of the cookies your grandma always used to make. And you can put a little dab of vanilla extract on your wrist and smell it whenever you want to remember people. Right? So think of ways that you can engage all 7 of those senses. Maybe there's a touch that really reminded you of that person. For me, like when I was little, I used to be afraid of dying. And my grandmother, when she would put me to sleep at night, would just rub my forehead over and over and over again. And so sometimes when I want to remember my grandmother, I just rub my forehead gently over and over again, or I ask one of my children to do it. And they don't need to know why it's comforting or why it's a grief ritual or that it's about caring for that person. But if you can imagine at least one thing in each of the 7 senses that you can do individually or in your own home, that will it will go really far to erase that nagging still voice in the back of your head that says you didn't do it the right way or you didn't imagine it this way. The more you can have little rituals to tide you over until you can be in a communal space, I think the healthier and saner we'll all be on the other side of this, if that makes any sense.
Frederica had a suggestion around some books. I
Yeah,
would
we talked about
love
that. Yeah.
to hear about that as well, because thinking of how those senses work and reading and children and that kind of thing, I would love to hear.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Frederica. I'm associate pastor in Palo Alto Grace Lutheran. Might be a little traffic around here, people coming and going. So I have started working with these children's books, I think like 5 years ago. And I, as you might hear on my accent, I'm from Germany originally. So in Germany, pastors teach classes at school in religion. And I've done projects with kids in school of all age groups and in kindergarten and also with my confirmands. And so there are different, I think, and even adults could, I did it here actually. I had a good children's book and we read it with a women's circle, and it was a very good conversation starter. So there are 2 different kind of books, I think, that you can read. There is one if you are just generally talking about death, dying, saying goodbye as a concept. And then if you happen to be a family member or a friend of someone who dies, or if it's your pet or whatever. And so for the first group, I usually suggest, I don't have the list of titles right now with me. They are in my office. So when I get to my office, I can take all my books. But when you're part of the first group, you can just read the books through and have your kids or family members fantasize and think through it, or maybe act out even the stories, or just be creative. For the second group, there are often ideas like writing letters or developing a memory box, doing, like Megan suggested, doing stuff that you did with that person, just in remembrance. And I think what is important is to dose it very well. Don't do everything at once. Just take your time, and then now and then, when you feel like it, do something, add something to your memory box, or write a letter to that person, something you wanted to say. And if it's not a huge letter, just a small note, and put it in that box, and then maybe that helps. And at the point of time when we are able to go out again, I think it's a good ritual to visit the funeral site, if there is one, and bring this box and show it and talk about it to that person. I think that could be very helpful. And I'm a huge fan of always including kids in all of this. So in Germany, there is now a change in how you do funerals. My parents' generation was very careful about not including kids in anything. So I didn't witness the funeral of my grandpa, who lived with us and then suddenly wasn't there anymore, which kind of was it was traumatizing for me. So that's maybe why I was so interested in this topic. So just include them and tell them about your feelings in a manner they understand, and it helps you understand your feelings better too. I think this is as much as I'm saying, and I promise I sent the list.
Yeah, that was really great. I'm excited. I love that idea of doing it different tasks each week, or starting in one spot and then having a place that you're moving through. One of the most difficult things for grief is when it gets stuck. You get stuck in a pattern, or you get stuck in a place, and helping people continue to move in their grief. Not that there's a good grief, or not that there's a right way to do grief, not that there's like an end point where you're done with grief. But when grief gets stuck, it can be really problematic for people. And so to have different levels of things that people can try along their kind of timeline journey, I think is a really beautiful way to think about it. Amanda?
I think that's another point, Megan, to really lift up, is that there's no right way to grieve and there's no wrong way. And that's really important. I think I've heard a lot of widows and widowers and children who've lost parents who talk about, am I doing it right? Or maybe I should feel more sad about this, or maybe I'm really worried I'm too sad about this. I've seen, parents who've lost children who a year or two later are still are feeling self-conscious about the depth of their grief. And it's important as people who are accompanying people in grief to let people know whatever you're feeling right now is absolutely 100% okay, because you are feeling it. So therefore, it's okay to be feeling. Like, there's no right or wrong way to be grieving. If you laugh at a joke 24 hours after you've lost a loved one, it's okay to have laughed at a joke. If you are sobbing uncontrollably a year and a half later because you found a hair tie of your loved one and it smells like them for the first time in months, it's okay. Like, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. And one of the pieces about what we are currently experiencing is that we're going to have this immediate trauma to be working with, and the quick sprint of cancellations and making new plans and finding new ways to reach out to one another and all of those kinds of pieces. And then we're going to have the long-term decades of work of processing what comes from all of this, and giving yourself and those around you permission to experience your feelings is probably a huge piece. I love this idea of taking the pieces over time as well and giving space for it. And a piece on that is to say, having a location, Pastor Megan, I think you referenced this in having a location within your space, like as we're all hanging out in our houses, right? So having a space within the house, eventually having a space within the community. This is why graveyards and cemeteries are such holy and good places. We have spaces where we can go. For those who are contemplating the import of having a funeral, or the import of having a burial or a scattering of cremated remains, those kinds of pieces, the thing I will say is that there is a gift in having a location for people to be able to go and gather and remember. There's something that's very important about that, to be able to say, I know where I can go to remember and to re-story myself within my story of this love. And I know that many folks are comfortable with, for example, keeping cremated remains at home and having them with you within the home, and that is a good and fine thing to do if you choose to do that. And there is also a gift for many people to be able to go to a location in order to do a remembrance. And in times like this, maybe we aren't going to be able to have that because we aren't going to be able to gather and do burials and those kinds of pieces, or maybe we'll be in shelter at place for a little while and we aren't going to be able to go to the cemeteries or graveyards or to the river where we scattered the remains, right? Maybe we can't do those things. And so it contemplate how or when you create the space, you create the container for recognizing it. It's kind of like working from home, right? If you don't create a container for working from home, then you're always working while you're at home, every single moment, right? But if you can create a container for it, then you can delineate when you are working and when you are home. With your grief, it will always be a part of your journey. It is always an accompaniment partner. But if you give it a space to abide, then occasionally there will come a time where you can say, I'm going to leave you right here, and I'm going to go over here for a few minutes. And you'll still be tethered to the grief, but you can step away from it for a moment because it has a space to abide safely. And so in this time, especially when we aren't going to have as much freedom, that might be a really helpful tool, a really helpful tip. I love the sensory stuff too, Pastor Megan. Love that. It's so important to remember that we are more than just what we hear or what we see. I'm Southern, so man, my family's been sending like pictures of all the recipes. We've been cooking up like a storm since we've actually been home. I made biscuits and gravy and fried chicken and all kinds of stuff. So like, get those recipes going, all that kind of stuff. It's important to keep us connected.
Yeah, and remember too that it feels like this has never happened before because in one way it's never happened before. But if you are someone for whom reading historical documents are comforting, know that this has happened before, right? And so I'll put up a link to how people grieved and had funerals during the 1918 flu epidemic, when millions of people died of the flu and they couldn't go outside. Current estimates from UCSF is that they think 1.5 million people will die over the next year to 18 months from this, particularly vulnerable populations.
Is that here in North America or worldwide?
Here in the United States, that's the current estimate. Everything's an estimate. Math changes. That was an estimate that happened before we were all kind of locked down in these 7 counties. So I'm going to pray mightily that that's not the real number. But if it is, that's close to some of the numbers of how many people died in World War II, right? And so depending upon which country you're looking at, right? So thinking about how people responded to death after wars and how funeral arrangements happened when it was a lot of people who passed away. The reason I'm saying this is not to scare people. The reason I'm saying this is for faithful leaders. If we're preparing our hearts now for a large number of people to pass away, it's easier to know what self-care to do now if over the next 12 months. If someone was to say, you're going to do 40 funerals over the next 12 months, what kind of self-care would you want to do 4 months before that or 3 months before that, right? And so that's just my using a startling fact to say, start getting self-care now around your own heart's thoughts about grief. That could be reading about what other pastors did in history. Martin Luther made mighty use of the plague, right? And was able to really inspire generations well beyond about their own faith. So know that this is a time when people may be hungry for faith. We've actually had more people inquire about visiting since we weren't allowed to have church than wanted to come before that, because this is a time when people are trying to tap into where answers can come from. So fill your heart as often as you can. Utilize things like poetry. There's lots of beautiful poetry about life cycles, and like this is a time to like download an audiobook about Emily Dickinson poems, and like, right, all those people who have better words than us. You don't have to write a new sermon for each time if your heart isn't able and the spirit is so busy weeping that she doesn't got time to write our sermons, right? You can just start collecting as many beautiful poems about death right now as possible to be able to pull out during those moments, right? Familiarize yourself with the bits of of whatever the Book of Common Prayers are that are good for your faith. If you're a Lutheran, and you might be asked during this time to do funerals for people who are formally Catholic or Episcopalian and Presbyterian and all kinds of different faiths, know which parts of our rituals are the same in other faiths. The particular part you want to pay attention to if you have our Lutheran Book of Common Prayer is page 107, the commendation of the dying, right? So that prayer, commending people to heaven and asking God to receive them as a lamb of their own flock, that's the paragraph that if you're in a Methodist church, a Presbyterian church, an Episcopal church, right, wherever you find yourself is going to be the paragraph that people are waiting to hear. So you can say that paragraph in an email. You can say that paragraph on a phone call. You can say that paragraph in a very short, even card probably, right? But just know that for some people, having page 107 earmarked right now so that when you're unable to figure out which book to grab because you're weeping, it's pretty close by, right? And so I encourage people to care for their hearts as much as they're able, while also being their kids' school teachers and their own cooks for the first time in a long time maybe, and their own librarians. But if you can start collecting some of the stuff so that if the phone calls do come, you're ready. And then if no one needs a funeral, you're ready for the next time someone does, and you can rejoice in a lot of ways. So hopefully that wasn't too scary to name some of the predictions, but I just think as faith leaders, being surprised by large amounts of tragedy is a lot harder than if we had some time to prepare for it. And so
and may we be wrong, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
if we're over prepared, then we've done nothing but prepare ourselves and practice good self-care, and that's never a bad thing. Making certain you have a good pair of shoes that you can stand in soft dirt is not a bad thing to have handy.
That's right.
Making sure that you know that you have a coat that you can wear in the rain and still be warm and comfortable yourself, right? Like those are important things.
Right.
A tip from the Pacific Northwest, because we're heading into springtime when a lot of these services may be happening, and we may be able to do small outdoor graveside services with and for direct immediate family, right? So a couple of tips from the Pacific Northwest as we, I think, are heading towards wrapping up our time together is get yourself a binder. You can get a black binder, and then take your sheet protectors and turn them upside down so that the opening part of the sheet protector is at the bottom, and your papers can go in that way, so that if it's raining, the water doesn't wash away your printed text. And the rain, and if you can, get matte sheet protectors, so that if the sun randomly comes out, because the Holy Spirit is hilarious sometimes, and it can be pouring down rain, and then the next moment it's super bright and sunny and there's a rainbow over your head. This has literally happened to me in the Pacific Northwest, that the matte sheet protector doesn't have so much glare that you can't read anymore, because you don't want to be wearing sunglasses during funerals outside. So like super practical tips. But we're heading into spring and summer when these things might really matter as we go along. So be kind to yourself and be kind to your spirits. I think there's so much more that we can talk about funerals and grief and those kinds of pieces that haven't been discussed for years because people are afraid about talking about it. Maybe this is the time to start having those conversations.
Yeah. And kind of as one practical piece, one thing that might be really different in people's grief response is typically people have a period of time where they might go through belongings, which might or might not be possible if someone died of something that's infectious. So even if you just want to Google the names of places that do deep cleanings and do them in healthy ways after something being infectious, helping people get used to the idea that someone else is going to have to clean the space and they might not get to keep items depending upon what the items are, could be really helpful in their grief process, kind of before they try to take next steps about what happens for what's going to happen. And think about what your own personal deep cleaning looks like, right? Because at some point, we'll need to have a sign and a symbol for ourselves that the crisis is over. One of the difficulties that can happen when pastoring in times like this is that you can forget when something is over. And the more clinical way of talking about that is post-traumatic stress. When you believe you're still in an emergency, but the time has passed, right? And so what are the ways that you're going to clean your heart and clean your brain so that you'll know when the emergency is called off, right? We might have funerals longer than we're stuck in our homes, but what are the ways that we are going to have and be able to turn the page or have an endpoint to this era of what's happening? And that's going to be really important to think about, because we don't want to be people who are only stuck in death. We do know Easter is coming. And so to be people who can bring that joy and that spirit back to communities will be really important for us. So I don't know the answer for people individually to figure out how they're going to turn that page at the end of this. My hunch is maybe a lot of therapy and a lot of venting and a lot of collegial support and a lot of learning how to do this together. And maybe some of the pastors who come from war-torn places who are much more experienced at this than us will be the ones who lead us through that. Yeah. I kind of feel like, because it was such a heavy topic, Pastor Amanda, would you be willing to pray for us at the end of this?
Absolutely.
To help us, in terms of closing a chapter, to do what's next for us in our day.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So let us pray. God of grace and presence and resurrection promise, we know that you have proclaimed to us through the resurrection that death does not have the last word. We, in this time of Lent and in this time of pandemic, look at mortality with frightened eyes. But we ask that you would send your Holy Spirit to surround us and offer a peace that passes understanding. Help us to find moments of connection so that moments of letting go might be filled with grace. Help us to find times where we can share our stories, so that we may be restored with you, even as we are remembered by our loved ones. Give us grace and hope that as we look forward to ceremonies and rituals, we may trust your presence within our grief and guide those for whom this time is hard, that they may know that they are held in your love. We take these things and we offer them to you so that we may return to the work of the current day, asking that you would hold us and guide us, and that our service may be a blessing. Trusting in you and resting in your grace, we pray these things in the name of Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye.
Bye. Do you want to say hi to Amanda?
We're recording still.
Hold on. I know, I'm trying to, hold on. I had a kid jump on top of me.
This is what happens with tech sometimes. It stays recording even when we think we're done.
Yeah.